Ever wonder what really separated us from the rest of the animal kingdom? I mean, long before towering skyscrapers, way before the internet, even before recorded history as we know it, what did our ancient ancestors actually care about? What drove them? If you strip away every piece of modern technology, what is the absolute fundamental core of the human experience? Well, today, we're going to answer exactly that.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening up the human blueprint. We're going to reconstruct the foundation of who we are by digging into three core pillars: expression, communication, and connection. Let's find out how we evolved from simply surviving day to day to truly living.
Section 1. The first spark of art.
Way before humans were building actual cities, we were making art. In the deep, dark caves of places like France and Spain, Paleolithic humans would use burnt wood, red earth, and bone tools to paint these incredibly vibrant scenes of the beasts they hunted. And the fascinating thing here is they weren't just keeping a visual inventory of their food supply, they were actually seeking psychological pleasure, trying to capture the thrill of their world on stone. It really proves that the human desire to create art is just as primal and just as ancient as the desire to eat.
Section 2. From sound to the press. Making art alone in a cave is, well, it's kind of lonely, right? As tribes grew into larger societies, humanity desperately needed a way to share ideas across space and time. And the journey to get there is wild. It started in our earliest origins with humans simply mimicking the natural sounds around them, the rustling of trees or the rush of water. Over millennia, those sounds evolved into structured syllables. Fast forward to antiquity, and groups like the Phoenicians actually invented alphabets specifically to keep track of their complex trade networks. And then comes the 15th century game changer, the printing press. Suddenly, boom, a single idea could be duplicated thousands of times.
It's amazing how our ancestors ingeniously adapted their communication to whatever environment they were in. Take Sumerian cuneiform. Living in Mesopotamia, they needed weatherproof records, so they pressed wedge-shaped marks into durable clay. If you buried it, it survived. Contrast that with Egyptian hieroglyphics. Because they had access to river reeds, they invented papyrus, basically the very first form of paper. This allowed them to create beautiful, picture-based records for incredibly detailed storytelling, even if it was just a little more fragile than baked mud.
But, as we know, progress almost never happens without a healthy dose of panic. When the printing press arrived, which is arguably one of our greatest inventions, it wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. In fact, it was met with absolute terror. Professional copyists, who used to take up to 21 months to hand copy a single book, protested aggressively because they were terrified of losing their livelihoods. Meanwhile, the clergy and political elite completely panicked because they couldn't control the flow of information anymore. Because the press produced identical books at what they considered an unnaturally fast speed, many early printers were accused of witchcraft, and the machine itself was literally cursed as the devil's work.
Section 3. Ancient Marriage Customs.
When it comes to human connection, early marriage was nowhere near standardized. It was deeply practical, highly transactional, and sometimes downright shocking to our modern sensibilities. In Babylon and Greece, we see the formalization of the dowry, basically exchanging wealth for a bride. In ancient Jewish tradition, a poor man often paid with sweat. Texts tell us Jacob worked 7 long years tending flocks just to earn the right to marry. But then you look at certain historic Amazonian tribes, where the groom, after catching his chosen bride, would tie her to a tree and whip her. This was a ritual specifically intended to drive out evil spirits and purify her before they started their life together. It just shows how deeply intertwined marriage was with spiritual beliefs and raw survival instincts.
Section 4. The farewell journey and the dead.
So, from the beginnings of life and partnership, we eventually have to face the end. How did these ancient communities mourn? And how did they even conceptualize death? Well, the archaeological record is honestly a bit chilling. Before we had complex religions and beautiful temples, our earliest ancestors were just terrified of the dead. They couldn't always distinguish between someone who is heavily sleeping and someone who is deceased, and they fully believed the dead held a grudge. So early burials weren't really about honoring the deceased, they were about protecting the living. They would physically tie the hands and feet of a corpse and pile massive heavy stones right on top of the grave. Why? To literally pin them down. They were terrified the dead would rise as ghosts in the night and seek revenge.
Now, contrast that sheer primal panic with the meticulous, highly organized customs of the ancient Egyptians. To them, death was nothing to run from. It was just a continuation of life. But to live well in the next world, your ka, or your soul, needed its original body. Hence the incredible science of mummification. And you definitely couldn't travel empty-handed. They buried their dead with a full set of luggage. We're talking food, drink, weapons, jewelry, and even reading material. They included the books of the dead to help them safely navigate the trials of the underworld.
The Egyptians were actually so comfortable with mortality that they brought it right to the dinner party. This is an incredibly morbid but fascinating little detail. During massive banquets, while guests were feasting on salted fish and roasted meats, the host would literally pass around a small, carved wooden mummy. They'd show it to each guest and say, "Eat, drink, and enjoy life before this catches you." It was a stark, very tangible reminder to appreciate the present moment served right alongside dinner. From painting on cave walls to sending text messages, from fearing ghosts in the night to passing a mummy around at a dinner party, humanity's blueprint is complex, it's resilient, and it's always evolving. We look back at these ancient people and marvel at their ingenuity and, let's be honest, their oddities. But it begs a pretty provocative question for all of us today. Look around at your own life. Which of our modern, everyday customs do you think will look absolutely bizarre to humans looking back at us 5,000 years from now? Think about that for a second. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into an absolutely fascinating historical mystery. We're going to be looking at the striking, undeniable similarities between the accounts found in heavenly books, like the Torah and the Quran, and the ancient mythologies from totally disconnected civilizations, like Babylon and India. We are talking about the true foundational narratives of humanity here: our creation, a lost paradise, and a catastrophic deluge. How is it that cultures separated by massive expanses of geography and time somehow ended up telling almost the exact same stories? So, is the story of a great flood way older than we think? This is a question that's literally baffled historians, archaeologists, and philosophers for centuries. How does humanity's most famous survival story, like Noah's Ark, echo across ancient civilizations that seemingly had zero contact with one another? Let's unpack these texts side by side and observe some of these incredible parallels.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the first humans, from dust to the garden. Take a look at this foundational element of creation from the Quran, specifically Surah Ar-Rum. Notice the core concept here. It says humanity was created from a single, totally humble element, dust. The Creator literally fashions humanity from the ground itself, right before they disperse across the globe as living, breathing beings.
And honestly, it's pretty incredible how perfectly these traditions mirror each other. Over in the Torah, in Genesis, God forms Adam from dust and creates Eve. In the Quran, the account is almost identical. You've got creation from dust, a magnificent paradise, and a downfall triggered by a dark force, Satan, tempting them to eat from a forbidden tree. Dust, divine breath, paradise, and a singular forbidden test. It's totally parallel.
But wait, it gets better, because these ancient accounts actually map right onto physical artifacts left behind by some of our earliest civilizations. Now, we all know the story of the serpent, but check out this actual seal from Tepe Gawra, dating all the way back to 370 BCE. It clearly shows a man, a woman, and a giant serpent, with their backs bent in sorrow as if they're fleeing. It's just a striking visual representation of a story that permeated the ancient world way before a lot of these texts were even fully formalized. Moving on to Section 2, the Garden of Eden, mapping paradise.
So once those first humans were expelled, the memory of that lost paradise definitely lingered. But where exactly was it? For centuries, scholars and explorers have desperately tried to pinpoint Eden on a physical map. Why? Well, because the book of Genesis doesn't just describe some mystical, vague realm. It actually gives us literal GPS coordinates by naming 4 specific rivers. There's the Pishon, noted for a land rich in gold and onyx, the Gihon, surrounding Kush, and then 2 rivers we absolutely know today, the Tigris and the Euphrates.
Because of these very specific river names, historical theories have wildly placed the Garden of Eden literally all over the ancient map. If you identify that mysterious Pishon as the Indus River, boom, paradise is in India. If you think the Gihon is the Nile, then it's in Egypt. Or you follow the Tigris and Euphrates right back to the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia. It really shows this deep, universal human urge to anchor our shared origin stories to a physical place we can actually point a finger at. Which brings us to Section 3, the Great Flood, a global catastrophe. When you stack up the surviving heroes of these flood stories, a seriously fascinating picture emerges. Look at this. Noah builds his ark after getting a direct warning from God. Over in ancient Babylon, Utnapishtim builds a giant ship after a deity warns him of a coming deluge. And then, in ancient India, you have King Manu, who builds a boat after being warned by a giant magical fish. The specific cast of characters changes, sure, but that overarching narrative structure, it remains absolutely identical across completely disconnected cultures. To ground this in the Abrahamic perspective, listen to this direct command from Surah Hud in the Quran. make the ship under our eyes and our inspiration. The text vividly describes how Noah was mocked by his people. And honestly, you kind of can't blame them. I mean, the guy was painstakingly building this massive ocean-going vessel on bone-dry land for a catastrophe literally nobody else believed was actually coming.
But the details of how the flood actually kicks off, that's where things get really interesting. In the Quranic account, the floodwaters surprisingly gush forth from an oven, a tanur, which is a sudden violent eruption of water straight from the earth itself. Meanwhile, in the ancient Indian myth found in the Shatapatha Brahmana, King Manu saves this tiny little fish that eventually grows massive and physically tows his boat through the raging deluge. So you've got different specific details for sure, but the exact same core theme of divine intervention saving a chosen survivor.
And what happens when the waters finally recede? Well, the heavenly books tell us the ark safely settles on a high peak identified as Mount Judy or Mount Ararat. In the Indian myth, Manu is told to tie his boat to a tree in the Himalayas. So again, the map changes depending on which culture is telling the story, but the vessel always comes to rest on a sacred elevated mountain peak. It's a literal and metaphorical new beginning for humanity, safely above the drowned world.
All right, let's pull all these threads together in Section 4, Ancient Echoes, Coincidence or Shared Memory.
Think about it like this. Early humans created cave art, like these ancient depictions of hunters and animals, to document their fears and their realities. It reflects a deeply ingrained, shared human drive to record our world. And in that exact same way, vastly separated civilizations recorded remarkably parallel stories about our ultimate origins. They just traded cave walls for clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and memorized poetic verses. When you really pull back and look at the big picture, the shared arc of humanity is just undeniable. Across these completely different texts, we see creation from a single element of dust. We see a lost paradise ruined by a tempting force, so often represented by a serpent. We see a catastrophic global flood that completely wipes the slate clean. And we see a chosen survivor, warned in advance, tasked with saving life in a specially constructed vessel. So, what does this all mean? Why do disparate ancient cultures across the globe share the exact same memories of our beginnings? Are these striking, undeniable echoes just mere coincidence, the result of the human brain simply being wired to tell similar types of stories? Or do they point to the ultimate historical mystery, a genuine collective memory, passed down from the very dawn of our species? It's a pretty profound question to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.
Let's jump right into this explainer. We're about to uncover the bizarre, sometimes totally terrifying, but honestly fascinating origins of medicine. Seriously, forget everything you know about sterile hospitals, modern prescriptions, or anatomical charts. We're taking a trip way, way back to the dawn of civilization. Back to a time when your local physician was actually a mystical sorcerer. It's a wild journey into the ancient mind, where surviving a basic illness depended just as much on chanting spells as it did on anything physical.
So, got a fever? Why not try a wax voodoo doll? Just imagine for a second being an early human. You've come down with this sudden, burning fever. You feel incredibly weak. Well, you're not popping a scientifically formulated pill, and you're definitely not resting in bed while someone checks your temperature. Instead, your village healer might literally demand a lock of your hair, craft a wax figure of you, and perform this intense, dramatic ritual over it. I mean, sounds crazy to us, right? But this was the absolute reality of early survival. Let's look at exactly why our ancestors thought this was the absolute pinnacle of medical care.
The absolutely crucial point to understand here is that in the ancient world, medicine wasn't science at all. It was pure magic. Period. Our early ancestors had literally zero concept of biology, viruses, immune systems, or bacteria. So when severe illness struck, they didn't look inside the physical body for causes. They looked outward to the supernatural. To them, the physical world and the mystical world, they were the exact same thing. Early human existence was filled with unknown, invisible terrors. To really get this, you gotta put yourself in their shoes. They lived in a prehistoric world completely engulfed by the unknown, entirely at the mercy of massive, unpredictable natural forces. When massive storms raged, when lightning struck out of nowhere, or when an eclipse suddenly blocked out the sun, they didn't see weather patterns or astronomy. They saw angry, invisible forces at work. To the primitive mind, the world was packed with powerful spirits that dictated absolutely everything, especially life, death, and sudden illness. Because of that genuinely terrifying worldview, early humans categorized sickness in completely different ways.
Lacking any biological knowledge, they genuinely believed a sudden ache or a fatal fever was literally a punishment, maybe from angry spirits or the restless ghosts of the dead. They also strongly believed in the evil eye, the idea that someone could make you sick just by glaring at you with intense jealousy. Or they just figured a rival tribe had cast a direct curse on you. Sickness was never just a failure of your organs. It was always an invisible supernatural attack. Let's formally define this so we can really grasp their mindset. An ancient disease was considered a supernatural attack by invisible forces, rather than a biological failure of the body. Think about it. If an illness is caused by a magical attack, well, you need a very specific type of warrior to fight back, right? You obviously can't fight an evil spirit with a bandage. You have to fight magic with magic. The contrast between a modern doctor and an ancient healer is just staggering. Today, a modern doctor relies entirely on science, biology, and chemistry to treat the physical body. But the ancient sorcerer doctor? Yeah, they didn't use chemistry. They relied heavily on fear, elaborate spells, immense social authority, and highly dramatic rituals. These healers were seriously intimidating figures in the tribe. Their entire job was to use their personal power and mystical connections to literally scare or force the sickness right out of you. Okay, let's dive into the actual treatment. We're looking at the historical steps of a wildly popular ancient prescription known as contagious magic. This is specifically documented in ancient Egyptian papyrus records, by the way. Step 1, the sorcerer collects a piece of the patient. We're talking hair, nail clippings, maybe a scrap of worn clothing. Step 2, they embed these personal items right into a wax or clay doll meant to represent the sick person. And step 3, they pierce, burn, or enchant that doll to manipulate the illness. The core belief here was that because the doll contained a literal piece of the patient, whatever magical healing or pain was inflicted on the doll would magically transfer straight into the patient's body, forcing the illness to flee. And you know what? Contagious magic was just one tool in their incredibly creative medical kit. Just look at these bizarre ancient prescriptions. People wore massive physical amulets and specific charms around their necks, day and night, just to repel spirits. They'd hang animal horns, like sheep horns, right over their front doors to specifically ward off the evil eye. In some cultures, they would even take a sick person and secretly hide them away in a forest hut, genuinely believing they could trick the diseased sorcerer into losing their scent. Actually, my absolute favorite? They'd perform rituals to transfer the sickness out of the human body and directly into an animal, or even into a sacred fly kept in a little jar. I know, it sounds totally wild to us, but back then, this was serious life-or-death healthcare. The connection between healing and magic was so deeply intertwined that ancient languages actually reflected it permanently. Check out this ancient Arabic linguistic proverb. Is your medicine magic, or is it madness? This totally captures the era. It proves that for early civilizations, the concepts of healing, sorcery, and just sheer irrational belief were completely blurred together. To them, effective medicine was magic. There was simply no dividing line whatsoever. But hold on, here is the massive question that kind of changes everything we've just talked about. If their doctors were just out there casting fake spells, piercing wax dolls, and waving animal horns around, how did humanity survive? I mean, why did people keep going to these sorcerers generation after generation if they were just complete charlatans? Well, the shocking truth is, this magic actually worked for a lot of people. But why? The answer to that mystery lies in a massive secret weapon: psychological influence and the placebo effect. You see, the sorcerer's true power wasn't actually in the wax doll or the chanted spell at all. Their real, incredibly potent magic was the profound psychological impact they had on a desperate, terrified, and totally believing patient. By healing the mind, they were, in turn, actually healing the body. Let's break down the psychology of ancient healing, because this brilliantly illustrates the incredible power of the human mind. First up, those dramatic rituals, the chanting, the smoke, the intense focus, that commanded absolute, total belief from the patient. Second, the sorcerer held immense social authority in the tribe, which sparked intense hope in someone who previously thought they were total goners. Third, the sheer force of the sorcerer's suggestion acted almost like an early form of clinical hypnosis, which instantly calmed the patient's severe panic and anxiety. And finally, this incredible, strong, unshakable faith in the cure essentially relieved the body's stress. This allowed the human immune system, which, remember, they knew absolutely nothing about, to naturally kick in and trigger a recovery. So, the ancient sorcerer was actually an accidental yet total master of the placebo effect. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on.
Over thousands of years, we've thankfully traded our wax dolls for antibiotics and our sorcerers for scientists. But think about it. When you visit a modern doctor in a crisp white coat, sitting in a sterile office, hanging on to their every single word of authority, how much magic, that deep human belief, that inherent trust in authority, and that comforting bedside manner is actually still doing the healing today. Definitely something to think about the next time you get a prescription. Thanks so much for joining me on this fascinating journey into the ancient mind. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time. Welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right in today because we've got a lot of ground to cover. You know, we often think of the modern world as this product of just the last couple of centuries. We look at our smartphones, our massive global economy, the jets flying overhead, and we kind of pat ourselves on the back for being so incredibly advanced. But what if I told you the blueprints for our most crucial modern systems were actually drawn up millennia ago? Today, we're completely challenging those assumptions and looking at the ancient world through a totally different lens.
Seriously, who actually invented the money you've got in your wallet? Or the massive cargo ships crossing our oceans? What about the airplanes in our skies? I need you to forget everything you think you know about modern innovation. Just erase the Wright brothers and modern central banks from your mind for a few minutes and get ready to travel thousands of years back in time. We're going to meet the original hackers of human civilization.
Now, take a look at this. It's a piece of primitive cave art showing early hunters with bows and arrows. It looks super simple, right? Just basic everyday survival. But our source text reveals something fascinating. This jump from basic hunting to the mind-blowing engineering leaps our ancestors were about to make is proof of something incredible. It proves that complex innovation and problem-solving are literally hardwired into our human DNA. I mean, we went from this cave art to conquering the planet in the blink of a cosmic eye. Section 1. The economics of survival. The barter problem. Okay, consider the sheer difference in efficiency here. On the left, we've got the classic barter system. Imagine you're a blacksmith, but you need wheat. You have to go out and find a farmer who happens to need a sword right at that exact moment. Trading cows for swords or grain for clothes was literally holding society back. It was slow, it was clunky, and honestly, just a massive headache. But then came the ultimate financial hack, right over on the right. Standardized currency. No more arguing over how many chickens equal a farming tool. The value is locked in. So, how exactly did we get there? Let's walk through this timeline of economic evolution. We start at step 1 with the exchange of raw goods. As societies got bigger, step 2 kicks in. Ancient peoples moved to weighted metal ingots, basically heavy, unshaped chunks of metal. But the absolute game changer happens right here at step 3. The Lydians, over in Asia Minor, cracked the code and minted the very first official coins around 716 BC. And then later, at step 4, King Croesus took it a step further by introducing standardized gold coins around 550 BC. To really understand why coins were such a massive deal, you have to realize how frustrating step 2 actually was. 60 minas equaled 1 talent, which was an incredibly heavy unit of weight. Just imagine trying to buy your weekly groceries while dragging around literal boulders of metal measured in talents. Small, light coins finally made daily transactions completely effortless. The relief was absolutely massive. Listen to what the philosopher Aristotle said about it. We have finally rid ourselves of the annoyances of constant weighing. The crucial takeaway here is that this one invention changed daily life forever. Merchants could finally just count their money quickly instead of pulling out a cumbersome scale for every single loaf of bread they sold. It completely sped up commerce and ultimately built empires. Here's the anatomy of that breakthrough. A Lydian coin was a piece of metal with a specific weight, sure. But the absolute genius part, the true innovation, is the state stamp. The source notes they often used a symbol like a jackal. That stamp meant you could finally trust the value blindly, without having to weigh it yourself. The state guaranteed it. It is literally the exact same concept that gives the paper money in your wallet value today. Section 2. Conquering the oceans, escaping the land. So, as societies grew, 2 great ancient maritime superpowers emerged to escape the boundaries of land. Looking at the top row, we have the Egyptians dominating the Nile and the Red Sea. These guys were the masters of scale, building giant cargo ships and massive trade fleets. Below them, the Phoenicians. Now they were the daring explorers. They mastered the harsh Mediterranean Sea, getting into deep-water navigation, a little bit of piracy, and setting up distant, powerful colonies like Carthage. They were the original masters of the deep ocean. let's zoom in on that Egyptian naval engineering for a second, because the scale they worked at is just insane. Our sources reveal we're talking about massive naval battle fleets under Ramses III. And get this, cargo ships 81 meters long and 27 meters wide. That's almost the length of a football field. They built ships large enough to carry massive solid stone obelisks all the way from the quarries of Aswan down the river to Karnak. Plus, Queen Hatshepsut launched these incredibly wealthy trade expeditions to Punt. These weren't just simple boats, they were floating ancient cities. Section 3. The ultimate dream. Conquering the sky. Now, when you think of aviation, you probably immediately picture the Wright brothers in 1903, right? Well, ancient Egyptian records tell a wildly different story. Our source text details some incredibly wild early experiments. There's the legend of the scholar Tahotep, who allegedly tried to fly using a giant, powerful eagle. Even crazier, 4th Dynasty engineers literally built wings out of linen and animal fat and jumped off the pyramids. They were even testing air resistance with primitive parachutes and using wind direction bags, basically ancient windsocks, for navigation. The absolute obsession to conquer the air started thousands and thousands of years ago. Section 4. The Flight of Abbas ibn Firnas. Okay, the sheer audacity of this man's flight plan is just incredible. Let's narrate this step by step. Step 1, he actually covered his own body in feathers and silk to mimic a bird. Step 2, he attached mechanical wings that he engineered all by himself. Step 3, he leaps into the air and, guys, he actually flew a significant distance. He was really gliding. But then comes step 4. He crash-landed violently. Why? Well, in all his brilliant engineering of the wings, he forgot one absolutely critical thing: a tail. Birds use their tails to land safely, and unfortunately for his back, Abbas learned that the hard way. Still, what an absolute pioneer. And that brings us to the core message tying all these chapters together. Human ingenuity is truly timeless. From realizing that carrying chunks of metal was super annoying and inventing the minted coin, to floating 81-meter ships down the Nile carrying solid stone, to literally jumping off buildings wearing feathers just to touch the sky. This relentless, beautiful drive to solve impossible problems has always been the heartbeat of the human story. Which leaves me with a pretty provocative question for you to ponder. What impossible problem of today, maybe it's interstellar travel or curing aging entirely, will our descendants look back on in 10,000 years and think, wow, those primitive humans actually figured it out? It really makes you wonder what we are capable of next. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer. All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Bizarre diets and buried secrets, the reality of the ancient world. You know, we usually picture the ancient world through this lens of pristine marble statues and grand pyramids, right? But the actual truth, it is way grittier. It's sometimes genuinely terrifying, and honestly, it's always completely fascinating. Today, we are peeling back those polished layers of history. We're going to look at everything from some seriously bizarre, stomach-turning diets to the cutting-edge science of archaeology that lets us dig up these buried secrets. It's going to be a pretty wild ride, so let's get into it. So what was actually on the menu in the ancient world? To really kick things off, we've got to ask that simple but honestly kind of terrifying question. What did ancient people actually eat when they got hungry? Because I promise you, way before the days of modern agriculture and 24/7 supermarkets, dinner time was completely different depending on exactly where you lived. We're talking about survival and customs that will literally make your jaw drop. Just look at this massive contrast. On one side, you had a normal diet. Ancient Egyptians were casually snacking on raw, salted fish. And the Babylonians, they would actually dry their fish out, crush it up in a mortar, and bake it right into their bread. A little strange to us today, maybe, but, perfectly reasonable. But then, on the extreme end, in certain ancient tribes deep in South America, the menu took a really dark turn toward ritualistic cannibalism. And the sheer brutality of these cannibalistic rituals, it went way beyond just getting a meal. It was deeply woven into their beliefs. When they captured an enemy, or even if they decided to sacrifice one of their own leaders, the victim would be tied up and crushed on a massive tree trunk. And while this was happening, the women of the tribe would circle around, screaming and singing in this frenzied celebration before consuming the remains. But here is the most chilling part, hands down. In some tribes, if a husband was killed, his widow was forced to participate. They would literally tie her fingers together to make a spoon, and she had to use that spoon to eat her own husband's flesh. Just an absolutely astonishing, horrifying glimpse into ancient tribal life.
Okay, so after hearing something that shocking, you really have to wonder, how do archaeologists even know these dark secrets from thousands of years ago? It's not like we have video footage. What we do have are echoes. Things like ancient cave paintings left behind as clues, kind of setting the stage for archaeological discovery. But finding and actually interpreting these echoes, that is where the genius of modern science comes in. It basically comes down to some brilliant detective work. First, they study ancient folklore. Scientists read old texts from early writers like Herodotus to find hints about where lost cities used to be. Step 2 is so clever. They look for darker vegetation. Grass growing over buried ruins is actually richer and darker than the grass around it. Step 3, they use aerial photography to spot those subtle differences from the sky. And step 4, math. An archaeologist can measure a single broken column base and accurately reconstruct the size of an entire lost structure. But the investigation doesn't stop at dirt and stones. Modern archaeologists use medical science to unlock secrets hidden literally inside ancient bodies. A perfect example is the groundbreaking work done by Dr. Candelas' team from Brooklyn University. They tested ancient remains, looking past just the bones to find actual biological fingerprints. 5,000. To show you exactly how precise this gets, Dr. Candelas' team tested the tissue of 130 Egyptian mummies to find their blood types, and they successfully extracted exact blood types like A and B from remains that were 5,000 years old. Even crazier, it was a perfect match with the blood types of people walking the streets of Cairo today. 5,000 years later, our core biology is still exactly the same. All right, moving on to our next section, the familiar end, the birth of the Olympics. Let's get into it. So let's look at this timeline. It maps out the incredible journey of the Games. They started way back in 776 BC in ancient Greece. For a millennium, it was the absolute peak of athletic achievement. But then, in 394 AD, the Games were completely canceled, just banned. It actually wasn't until the year 1900 AD, over 1,500 years later, that they were finally revived in Athens, kicking off the global spectacle we all watch today. Now, the ancient Games were a bit different than what we see on TV today. It was a massive, exhausting 5-day duration. You had running, jumping, wrestling, chariot racing. But here's the wild part. The Games were so respected that there was a complete halt to warfare. All fighting stopped just so they could play sports. Imagine that happening today. And the grand prize for the winners? No multi-million-dollar deals. They received an olive wreath and a lifetime pension from their home city. That's it. And for sure, boxing has ancient roots. It was a massive staple of these ancient games. We tend to think of boxing as a newer prize-fighting thing, but its origins are buried deep in antiquity. It was even famously documented by the poet Homer in the Iliad. People have literally been gathering to watch athletes test their physical limits against each other for thousands of years. Which really leaves us with this final question. When future archaeologists dig up our ruins, what weird habits will they uncover about us? We've used aerial photography and medical science to uncover their bizarre diets and glorious games. But thousands of years from now, when they dig through our concrete and plastic, what are they going to think was absolutely insane about us? And what will they recognize as purely human? Something to think about. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me today, and I'll catch you next time.
You know, we kind of just take it for granted that human history is this straight, predictable line of progress, don't we? I mean, we look around at our smartphones, our modern cities, all our medical breakthroughs, and we naturally assume that, hey, we are moving relentlessly upward, leaving our primitive origins way behind in the dust. But what if that assumption is literally entirely wrong? In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into a debate that has raged for millennia, and it honestly tears at the very fabric of how we view ourselves and our place in the universe.
And that brings us to the ultimate philosophical question. Are we actually advancing and evolving upwards from primitive origins? Or, on the flip side, are we degrading and falling away from a lost perfect golden age? It's basically an intellectual heavyweight bout. You got the tragic, poetic worldview of ancient philosophers going right up against the cold, mechanical observations of modern science. To truly get where this mystery started, well, we have to travel pretty far back in time.
Think about those raw, visceral depictions of a hunt you see in ancient cave art. For the ancient detectives and early philosophers who were first trying to piece together human history, artifacts like those posed a massive puzzle. Did those primitive tools and drawings represent the absolute beginning of humanity? You know, a brutal, ignorant starting line from which we've just slowly climbed?
Or did they represent the surviving remnants of a once great civilization that had suffered a catastrophic fall from grace, leaving humans to basically wander the wilderness in a state of primitive decay?
Okay, Section 1, the Greek philosophy revolution.
To make sense of our origins, we absolutely have to look to the thinkers who first studied humanity through logic. And the first of these great disruptors was Socrates, born way back in 470 BC. Socrates was a skeptical rebel. He completely shifted the intellectual focus from just debating abstract myths to the rigorous, logical analysis of human morality facts. He firmly believed that virtue itself is knowledge, and that ignorance is the true root of vice. He was so dedicated to this pursuit of truth, and honestly so threatening to the establishment of Athens, that when he was given the choice between abandoning his ideals or accepting a death sentence, he famously drank a cup of poison. No way was he backing down.
So that intellectual foundation leads us directly to his most famous student, Plato, born in 427 BC. Now, Plato was the ultimate idealist. While Socrates focused on ethics, Plato looked at the very nature of reality itself. He established the theory of forms, basically arguing that true, perfect reality existed in this independent, ideal world that we can't even see. For Plato, the physical world we experience every day is just a flawed shadow of that perfect reality. Actually, he went so far as to view the physical human body as a mere prison for the eternal, knowledgeable soul.
Rounding out this legendary trio is Aristotle, born in 384 BC. Aristotle, who, fun fact, famously tutored Alexander the Great, took a completely different approach from Plato. He was a hardcore empirical observer. He spent his time observing nature, classifying animals, and studying biology. Aristotle essentially laid the groundwork for biological evolution long before the modern era even started. Through his deep observations, he mapped out a continuous biological chain connecting all life forms, recognizing that there is this connected, hereditary line running throughout all of nature.
Moving on to Section 2, Plato's theory of degradation.
While Aristotle was busy observing biological connections, Plato looked at the broad sweep of history and saw something entirely different: tragic decay. Just consider this massive number for a second: 72,000. Plato argued that human history absolutely does not move in a straight, infinite line of progress. Instead, he believed it operates in a massive 72,000-year cycle. According to his writings, the first half of this cycle is a divinely guided, perfectly utopian golden age. During this time, humanity lives in total harmony, blessed with supreme knowledge and simplicity, guided directly by the divine. Sounds pretty great, right?
Well, here is where the story turns dark. Plato theorized that in the second half of the 72,000-year cycle, divine guidance is withdrawn. God essentially steps back. And left entirely to our own devices, humanity begins a long, inevitable descent. Without that perfect spiritual anchor, human societies, physical bodies, and our moral compasses just slowly degrade over millennia. For Plato, all the suffering, ignorance, and conflict we see in our current world, those are just symptoms of this ongoing tragic era of historical decay. In his view, we aren't building a better future, we are losing a perfect past.
All right, Section 3, Mechanics of Evolution and Progress.
Leaving Plato's tragic decay behind for a minute, let's step right into the modern scientific worldview. Now, the theory of evolution didn't just magically appear out of nowhere in the 19th century. Its roots run really deep. Way back in 600 BC, the Greek philosopher Anaximander theorized that all life originated from a single original material source. Fast forward to 50 BC, and the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius was already writing about how only the strongest creatures survive to pass on their traits. This intellectual thread basically wove through history until 1858, when Alfred Russel Wallace outlined the mechanics of natural selection, which was followed immediately in 1859 by Charles Darwin's world-changing publication of On the Origin of Species.
Okay, let's rapid fire through the core mechanics of Darwinian evolution. It's a beautifully brutal mechanical process based on three main facts. First up, vast reproduction. Organisms just produce way more offspring than the environment can realistically support. Second, that leads to intense competition for limited resources. And third, survival of the fittest. In this ruthless struggle, any organism born with a slight advantageous variation has a much higher chance of surviving and dominating.
So the crucial point is summarized perfectly in this idea: the strongest survive and pass their victorious traits to the next generation. This relentless, mechanical efficiency of natural selection was championed by thinkers like Thomas Huxley, who saw it as the true engine of progress. And science only continued to back this up. Later in the 20th century, scientists like Dr. Morgan down at the University of Texas used X-rays on fruit flies to prove that sudden, dramatic genetic mutations actually happen. that completely validated the biological mechanics of how an entire species can rapidly adapt and transform.
Which brings us to Section 4, Evolution versus Degradation.
It's time to put these massive opposing frameworks head to head. I mean, just think about how stark this contrast is. On one side, we've got Plato's degradation, the philosophical belief that we are tumbling downward from an ancient, divinely perfect golden age, losing our moral and spiritual superiority with every passing century. On the exact opposite side, we have Darwin's evolution, the scientific certainty that we are relentlessly ascending, climbing out of the primordial mud, mechanically adapting and improving upon primitive biological forms. It is the ultimate friction between a history defined by tragic decay and the history defined by relentless progress.
And finally, Section 5, Conclusion. Life's complex nature.
So, who's right? Are we falling angels or rising apes? Well, the truth is, the history of life in humanity isn't just a simple straight line in either direction. It's a chaotic, complex mix of forces. We definitely experience periods of slow, gradual biological and social evolution. We also experience moments of sudden, revolutionary mutations, both in our genes and in our technology, drastically leaping us forward. But we also absolutely experience tragic periods of degradation, where societies collapse, knowledge is totally lost, and we frankly regress. History is just the messy, fascinating combination of all three.
Which brings us to our final, provocative thought. Take everything we've explored today, from those ancient caves to Plato's cycles to Darwin's mechanics, and just look at the modern world around you today. With our incredible technological leaps paired with our massive global conflicts, which force do you think is winning right now? Are we currently in a phase of rapid upward evolution, or are we experiencing a period of hidden degradation? It's a question that has haunted philosophers for thousands of years, and now it's yours to answer.